Hot Ticket is such a brilliant episode of Frasier. This is the 4th episode of the 6th season. This is directed by David Lee. And as always, there will be spoilers from now as I go through the episode and share some thoughts. And this one starts off with Frasier talking with Martin. He's going to see this play called Tears of the Mariner. Daphne then comes in. She's really excited because her photograph's in the paper. A photographer was just taking photos of random shots of Seattle life, and she's rather happy. They then go down to the theatre, and Niles feels like he's being shunned from all of these events, but tonight that's not going to happen because they're going to see this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, the play. They're potentially looking forward to it, but they're more so looking forward to seeing Sir Trevor performing, and we'll come back to Sir Trevor later on. And they approach the door, they get the tickets out, and honestly, it's one of my worst nightmares. That's maybe an exaggeration, but it is an anxiety that I, and I'm sure many people have. The tickets are for the matinee. There is nothing worse than the fear of booking tickets months in advance and forgetting you've booked the matinee. Whenever I book tickets to a show, I'm always obsessively checking the tickets to make sure it's either the evening or the matinee. Unfortunately, they didn't do that. And they can't go and see the show because it was for the matinee of that day. And their only choice is to wait in the cancellation line. And they don't want to do that. Frasier is pretty confident that he can get tickets for the next show, the final show. And we cut to the next night. Niles comes over, they're smartly dressed again. Frasier didn't manage to get the tickets. And Martin said something that I thought was quite interesting. And it's part of the theme of the episode. Martin says, and I quote, "You just want to go because all your snobby friends are going and you don't want to feel left out." On the one hand, I can feel that being the case. But at the same time, I do think they genuinely want to see Sir Trevor performing. And I think they will regret it if they don't get this opportunity. And the only event I've ever regretted not going to is Kelsey Grammer. Ironically, he did a talk in London a couple of months before I started watching Frasier. And I am kicking myself that I missed him just before this. This was, I think, the end of 2019. I've just checked. It was mid-2019, and I started watching Frasier very early 2020 when the world started to fall apart, and just missing out by a couple of months. So I understand. I don't think it is just that they want to see this because they'll feel left out. I do think they genuinely have a strong desire to see Sir Trevor, and unfortunately, I can understand the regret of not getting that opportunity. And they realise they're going to have to go in the cancellation line. So they do. And Roz has tickets. A friend had tickets and she didn't want to go, so she gave them to Roz. Roz has brought a date. Niles tries to take the tickets from Roz. She kicks him, which I have to say, good for her, because Niles doesn't deserve her tickets. And honestly, it seemed like they're this close to getting tickets. I think they were next in the cancellation line, or maybe there was one person in front of them. But then they see some friends or some acquaintances, and they don't want them to think they're in the cancellation line, so they step out of the cancellation line, which was obviously a really big mistake. And they didn't get tickets. And the next thing we see, Niles is standing outside the theatre during the intermission, pretending to smoke, which I have to say, I don't think he needed to do. There's nothing wrong with going outside during the intermission just to get a breath of fresh air. a breath of fresh air among all of the smokers. But I feel like he didn't need to pretend to smoke. I guess it gave us a bit of comedy, but I never find smoking to be funny in any regard. So I didn't love that, but it made sense within the context of the narrative. And it turns out those friends or acquaintances are actually having to leave early. So Frasier and Niles try to sneak in and take their seats, but of course they're not allowed back in because they don't have their tickets. And then they're also invited to a late supper with those friends. Sir Trevor's going to be there. So they realise, okay, we can't see the play, but at least we can meet Sir Trevor. So they rush back to Frasier's apartment. And this is really interesting, moderately interesting, because this would not play out this way if this aired today. Because they have to ask Martin what the newspaper said about the play. Martin had read the review, but Frasier had avoided everything to avoid spoilers, which is completely fair enough. But if this had aired today, obviously all of that information would be on the internet. So this wouldn't have played out the way. And I find that kind of amusing. Most episodes of Frasier, I'd say, are pretty timeless. But things like this, just little things, dated it a little bit, but in a way that's charming, and I rather enjoy it. And Martin can only tell them a little bit about what he read, and it turns out the review was actually on the back of Daphne's photograph, which she had cut out and was sending back home. And, well, Frasier decides to open the letter to try and read it, but Daphne comes in at that moment and she thinks that he's spying on her. Honestly, she didn't lose her mind as much as I would have done. She ranted a little bit about how she knew Frasier dyed his hair, but honestly, if somebody had opened a letter I had written, I would have been really, really annoyed by that. So, yeah, she was angry, but I don't think she was angry enough. And Frasier and Niles have nothing else to do except go to this supper with the tiny bit of information they had from Martin. And they go there, and Sir Trevor arrives. He's played by Fritz Weaver, and he's introduced to Doctors Niles and Frasier Crane, and he's interested in their opinion of the play from a psychological perspective. He wants their psychological interpretation, which is tremendously awkward. Niles flees. He can't deal with this. He goes to pretend to take a phone call or to phone home. And Frasier has to try his best to get around the question while answering the question of what did you think? And honestly, he did a good job of it. I was waiting. I couldn't remember how this played out. And part of me was waiting for Sir Trevor to say something that would trip Frasier up. But at the same time, why would he? He had no reason to think that Frasier hadn't seen it. So I think the exchange went very well, actually. And once Sir Trevor walked away and Niles came back, Frasier said something that I think was, well, basically summing up the entire episode. And he says, "We missed a potentially life-changing experience in the theatre because we were too embarrassed to be seen in the cancellation line." And that basically sums it up. They were more worried about how people perceived them than the actual experience itself, which kind of ties in with what Martin said about people only going for the theatre to, well, so they don't get left out and to show off, I guess, for their friends who didn't get to go. They can have the story of, well, they got to see this performance. They got to experience the once-in-a-lifetime experience. But Frasier realises that it's more about having the experience than being able to say you had the experience. And I thought it was a really interesting moment. And then that kind of all falls apart when their attitudes change again, when they're invited to another event. So it's a decent episode. Really thoroughly enjoyed it. If you go to the theatre, if you can relate to this in any way, I think you'll really thoroughly enjoy it. I have to say, despite the fact there's not a lot of variety in what happens, we go back and forth to the same locations, I really enjoyed it quite a lot. I think Hot Ticket, it's an absolute delight. Definitely a very memorable episode of Frasier, and certainly I'm sure it's one that I'll always really thoroughly enjoy.